Hello, America. Welcome to a special edition of the Glenn Beck program. America's history is being distorted, and our kids aren't being taught the truth. These are just one of the things that we learned on this program, and one of the things this show has tried to do from the beginning is set the record straight. Where else on TV would you hear that some women in the 1700s were actually allowed to vote? Did you know that? Or that African Americans were judges, politicians, preachers at white churches. They were patriots in the Revolution. Did you know that? Tonight you're going to get a crash course on our founding fathers. Historian David Barton of Wall Builders will be joining us throughout the hour. He's got some stuff today that I can guarantee that most has never learned in school. But first, here's the reaction we got to Founders Fridays.
I was really thrilled to see how popular the shows became. I mean, the feedback was just phenomenal. Part of what people responded is, I've never heard this before.
I'm just now finding out about these things.
Well, this is my first time ever hearing it. Why didn't I learn any of this?
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The way we have taught American history for 60 years is called deconstructionism. And deconstructionism is an attempt to destroy or deconstruct what's going on. And within that framework, what you do is you always teach the negatives, not the positives, because that's what they've been taught in school. If there's a wart on the nose of American history, they heard it. If it was the witch trials, if it was treatment of Indians, if it was slavery, they heard it. Didn't hear any of the good stuff, but heard lots of the negative stuff. I think the two Founders Fridays that I heard the most about were the black founders, part one and part two, and then the women founders. I mean, we have some concept of who Sam Adams is and Ben Franklin and the others, but it was like brand new territory on the black founders and the women of the Revolution.
On the Women of the Revolution show, we learned all about the role of our founding mothers, the role they played right alongside our founding fathers. But what took many of our viewers by surprise was this. Let me ask the audience on when did women get the right to vote? 1920. Yes, 1920. What would you say if I told you not true? Women could vote in the 1700s. Would anybody believe me?
New Jersey, they wrote into the Constitution the right for women to vote. So women started voting in New Jersey in 1776. And that was a right that the Founding Fathers put into the documents. And women had voted in colonial America before that as well. Pennsylvania back in the French and Indian War, etc. But they put it in the Constitution.
All right, but it wasn't in Pennsylvania, was it a constant?
It was not constant. Interestingly enough, the voting rights were tied a lot of times to ownership of property. If you owned property, you could vote. So women could vote if they owned property, but a lot of times being married to the husband's property is in the husband's name. But if the husband died and the woman inherited the property, she could vote. By 1809, most of the women were voting with the Federalists. So when the Anti-Federalists got power in New Jersey, they said, wipe out the women's vote. They're voting in the wrong political party. We're not going to be able to sustain ourselves with it. So that's really where the woman's right to vote went away. It wasn't on grounds of equality or inequality. It was on the grounds of, they vote for the wrong party. Now that we've got control, we're going to take the power away.
On that program, what also took a lot of viewers by surprise was that some women actually served in the military during the American Revolution. I have to ask you about this handsome lady.
1782, she wanted to do something for her country. She dressed like a man and went enlisted. Now, what's interesting is she's 22 years old at the time, and the other guys in the Army always kidded her about, you never shave. You're just a kid. Yeah, of course she didn't shave. She's a lady. She got wounded in a battle up at West Point, and she treated the wound herself so no one would find out what her gender was.
Holy cow.
She later, in Philadelphia, came up with a really high fever, almost unconscious, and so a physician had to check her, and at that time found out what her gender was. So when they found out the gender, they quietly moved her out of the Army, but General Henry Knox is the one that gave her an honorable discharge out of the Army at West Point.
Wow.
She ends up with a military pension because she served as a soldier, and if you were a soldier, you got the pension. So pretty cool story.
Pritchard. She was commissioned by Washington.
She was commissioned because she got the name, Mary is her name, Molly's the nickname. In the Battle of Monmouth, 1778, June, really hot day, and if you're part of the artillery crew with all that powder going off and the heat and everything. And so guys were falling from exhaustion. She was running back and forth to the creek and the well, carrying pitchers of water for them to keep dehydrating. And that's how she got the name Molly, pitcher. Well, when her husband fainted from exhaustion, she stepped right in and became the rammer, and that thing kept the gun firing and did so throughout the rest of the battle. And at the end, when they found out what she'd done, that she'd kept that gun alive, but because it takes several guys in the crew to keep the gun alive. You got to have the rammer and the cleaner. You got to have the one that puts the powder, the guy who fires it, names it. So she kept that gun going throughout the battle. And at the end, she was commissioned as a sergeant in the Continental Army. Now, Washington, we think, did it. It may have been General Nathaniel Greene, but either way, it was a general that commissioned her. She served throughout the rest of the American Revolution. When she died, she was given a military funeral. She was buried with the honors of war and a military funeral at her death. Great lady, served throughout the Revolution.
Women were not the only unknown heroes of the Revolution. By far, the Founders Friday specials that got the most reaction from our viewers were the two shows we did on our black founding fathers.
In black history, it wasn't all just slavery. Oh yeah, it was there. But look, we had black founding fathers elected to office. We had a lot of black heroes who were heroes in the American Revolution, who were great military leaders.
I want to show you a painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunch of white guys, right? Unless you know where to look. Right here. That's Peter Salem. He was actually the hero of the battle. It doesn't look like he's a hero there. He looks like he's cowering behind the white guy with a sword. He was the hero of the battle. And he saved scores of American lives that day. Why don't we know this? Look at the picture of the Battle of Lexington. 150 Americans. There it is. Do you see any faces of color in this painting? They were all members of the Reverend Jonas Clark's church. They went out. They were actually, if I'm not mistaken, David, they were in church at the time, right?
He called them together at church,
okay,
yes.
So we called together at church and then said, let's go. And they went to defend their town. When the shot heard around the world was over that day, there were 18 Americans lying on the ground. What you don't see in this painting are the equal numbers of whites and blacks. They were white and black patriots. It was a mixed church. Did you even know that happened? One of those injured patriots on the ground in this painting was a black man named Prince Estabrook. I bet you never heard of Prince Estabrook before. How about the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware? Bunch of white guys, right? No. Look here. African American, helping row the boat across. You know what his name was? Prince Whipple. He fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. Take a look at this one, this painting of, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. If you look at this, you just think, oh yeah, and then he made his slave dress up like I don't know what. But that's what you would think, right? This guy is incredibly important. This guy may have won the Revolutionary War. James Armistead was his name. How did he win the Revolutionary War? Double spy. Basically, the Brits thought that he was spying for them, but he was spying for General Washington. He'd give the Brits bad intel and reveal the good critical information to General Washington. Did you know this story? Why? I'm so tired of people saying, well, it was just the white people, white people, white people. No. No. Why are we intentionally leaving others out? When did America have its first African-American judge?
1768. Wentworth Cheswell, New Hampshire, elected to office in New Hampshire. He was reelected for the next 49 years, held 8 different political positions. Really cool story about him is we all know that Paul Revere made his midnight ride. We also know he wasn't the only guy riding that night. Another guy riding, Wentworth Cheswell, black and white.
Now, how is it possible? Did you know that we had an African-American ride to say the British are coming, the British are coming? Amy did. Amy did. Anybody else besides Amy know that? 2, 3. Okay, 3 people in the audience.
He was such a great guy, and we never hear about him because he rode north and Paul Revere rode west. And Revere was going after Reverend Jonas Clark's church because that's where Hancock and Adams were, was him. And that's where we had blacks and whites, as you pointed out, laying on the ground after that battle. Wentworth Cheswell rode north telling people the British are coming. And it was from the north that all those people came to Boston to take on the British at Bunker Hill and everywhere else. This guy right here, this is Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes is a soldier in the American Revolution. He is a black preacher. He's the first black preacher ordained in America that was a pastor of a white congregation in Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, several places.
A black professor in
black
a
preacher,
white...
That's right, in a white church.
Yeah, black minister.
Black minister in a white church in 4 different states. He was ordained in the Congregationalist denomination in 1785. He's the first black to receive a master's degree in America.
When did we have the first Speaker of the House? 1789. When did we have our first black Speaker of the House? I bet most people would say never.
Never, except it was right here. Joseph Hayne Rainey. Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina is the first black to preside over the House of Representatives. These are the first 7 blacks elected to Congress. You have here Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. Senator elected. He was a minister of the gospel. He was a missionary. He worked with Frederick Douglass. He recruited 3 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, and he was a missionary to slaves in the South. You have here Benjamin Turner, Josiah Wall, the large. This guy right here is really cool. Robert Brown Elliott is probably the most brilliant guy of that era. He actually took on the vice president of the Confederacy in a debate on the floor and just tore his head off.
What was the relationship of our founders with African Americans? It depends on where you were. If you're in the South, it's a different relationship, right?
It was.
But our founders, the ones that really put everything together, they came from a world where we don't even understand it. We're striving to get back to this place. Are we not?
We are.
And I want to show. These are from old newspapers. This one is Caesar Glover, a colored man supposed to be about 80 years of age. This is a obituary.
Obituary.
He was brought from Africa as a slave when a child. He served in the Revolutionary War and is one of the pensioners of the United States. Okay, this one is at Providence at an advanced age. Bristol Rhodes, a black man of the late Revolutionary Army, in which he long served with deserved reputation. At the siege of Yorktown, he was severely wounded, having unfortunately lost a leg and an arm, and has since assisted on pension. Same story.
Same story.
A colored man named Henry Hill died at Chillicothe not long since the age of 80 years. He served faithfully in the Revolutionary War and was a participant in the battles of Lexington, Brandywine, Monmouth, and Princeton and Yorktown. He was interned with honors of the war. What does that mean?
Not only a pension, but he got a full military funeral as any veteran would get. So that's a military funeral with all the honors that go with being a veteran.
How many people here had any idea that our founders, the people at this time, would take a African American and bury them with the full military rights and honors? Anybody here believe that before just now?
This is good stuff. And again, it's not to say that slavery and the Jim Crow laws, et cetera, didn't happen. They did, but we got taught that in school. What we didn't get taught was the positive side of that aspect of history. We did so many programs, but there was a lot more we could have done. I mean, this could go forever. We didn't do anything about all the Jewish founding fathers. Mordecai Sheftel was a Jewish patriot who led the forces across Georgia. Francisco Salvador was the first Jewish patriot killed in the American Revolution, was ambushed by the British and the Indians and killed. If you go to Chicago, to the business district, you will see there a statue of 3 great folks in the American Revolution: George Washington, Robert Morris, and Haym Salomon. And Robert Morris and Haym Salomon were the 2 financiers that gave Washington what he needed to fight the war financially, one a Jew and one a Christian, and Washington holding the hands of both of them. And another aspect we hear nothing about is the young people. I mean, the fact that you take a John Quincy Adams at 8 years old with his musket out going after the British. Well, you look at Andrew Jackson, he was already a military prisoner of war at 11 years old from fighting in the Revolution. You take someone like James Iredell. At 17 years old, he was the chief financial officer over North Carolina. So there's just so much history we didn't get into that we could have gotten into on Founders Fridays.
Faith, hope, and charity. why we matched Sam Adams, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin up with those virtues. Ahead.
As a homeschool mom, I used a lot of the material that Glenn presents on Founders Friday. It's just been a great way to have some good discussion on American history.
I'm Jim Daugherty from New Jersey, and Glenn, I love watching Founders Fridays.